Hello. In this video, we will talk about the while loop, the second type of loops that we are going to see together. The first one was the for loop, and just as a quick reminder to remind you of how it was structured, the for loop has that structure here. It has a counter that we need to initialize, and in this case, we can call it whatever we want, if you remember. And then we have a condition which controls how many times this loop should run, which is dependent on the counter. So if I have a counter I, my condition most likely will be tied to this counter. And then I have an update for the counter, which could be an increment or a decrement. And then every time the loop runs an iteration, it goes back up, increment, checks the condition, go back and execute, update, check the condition, and so on. And this is where we got this loop. Now, if you remember also, we said that this is the basic thing that you need for any loop to be having these three major components, right? The counter, the condition, and update. And that is applied to also other types of loops. So today we are going to talk about the while loop. And the while loop reads a little bit different than the for loop. The for loop was for a specified number of times. Where is this counter going from 0 to 4? I would like you to repeat this code. On the other hand, even though we can do the same thing, the while loop reads as while the condition is true, keep repeating the following code. All right, so it means that it depends on a condition, right? Now that condition can be structured similar to the for loop. How is that? I need a counter. Let's build a counter, right? I need a condition which is associated with the while, then that is going to be my condition. Then I need an update, which is going to be inside this loop in here. Now, just a quick side note, the reason why I was able to use I, and I actually intentionally used I here, is to show you that I could use I here, and there's no conflict between this and that, all right? Even though I redeclared I here, that there's no conflict because the scope of this I is within this loop. So starting from here until here, this is the highlighted area that you are seeing here is the scope of this I. So there's no conflict between the two scopes. But of course, I could go and call this whatever I want, J, counter, whatever you want, all right? So in this case here, I called it I, and I'm going to print something like this here. Sys out, hello from inside the while loop. All right, and if I run it, it's going to run exactly the same. It's going to print 5 times, same exact thing. Now, another note here that less than or equal to 4 is exactly the same as less than 5. It's going to stop at 4 anyway. So I just wanted to point that out too, because you could put your condition either way and it's going to work. All right, so again, as we have seen here, we have the counter initialization. Then we have here right? And then we have here the condition. And then we have here the update. So the same 3 components that we found in the for loop are available here in the while loop. And in that case, it just works perfectly the same as the for loop. Another thing that I want to remind you of is that we said actually the for loop can be structured in a very weird way that we could put it as the initialization outside, the for loop header, every part of it is basically optional, right? So I could put the condition here, and then I could have the structure of the for loop and then the update inside if I want to, right? And if you compare this to that, this is exactly the same, right? But if you're going to separate the initialization from the update from the condition, then go with the while loop. This looks natural. This looks really ugly. So never do this one, all right? But now I'm showing you how they are close to each other, all right? All right, so again, this here just doing the same function. And then the question that comes to people who are learning loops for the first time and programming in general, they say like, okay, then what is the difference between the while loop and the for loop? And to understand this difference, we will have to discuss another aspect, which is how the flexibility of the while loop being a condition, depending on something being true or false, is going to control our flow. All right. So again, even though for has a condition, this condition has to be tied to this counter. But the while loop, there is no reason or there's no nothing that forces you to have this control here using this counter. All right. Now I will show you how in an example. But before we do this, let's talk a little bit about what are the possibilities of this loop. So the first thing that you need to know is that you can, again, increment or decrement. So I could start from end counter is equal to 20. And then I say while counter is greater than 0, I would like to print counter, and then I would like to decrement my counter with basically 2. So I'm going to print even numbers from 20 to 0 or backward. So 20, 18, 16, all the way to 2, I could put even equal to 0 here, and that could also work. All right. So that is working. You can call it whatever you want, and you can count backward. One other thing that we need to be careful about is removing or forgetting about, and this is a very common mistake for people using while loop for the first time, is that many people forget the increment, right? So notice that the for loop was very well structured. You have everything inside the header. It forces you kind of to fill these 3 components. The while loop is more loose. It's more open, right? So in this case, you have to take care of building a counter. You have to take care of putting the condition, which while forces you to. But then you also have to take care of updating your counter. And this means that if you forget this one, this can be problematic. You can end up with an infinite loop like this. Why? Because I is equal to 0, 0 is less than 4, yes, and it will always remain 0 is less than 4. I will never update, and this will never become false. And while true, keep repeating. All right? So that here is another important note about the difference between the while loop and for loop. All right, so what is the major difference? What makes while loop different from for loop? That's the big question here. And the answer is very simple. It's the fact that while loop depends on a condition. And I'm going to use an example that you have seen before because that is a great example to understand the difference. So let's say we have a loop that is going to loop and ask the user for a password as long as the password is wrong. All right. So while correct password, so here string correct password is equal to, let's call it disk45. All right. And then I'm going to prompt the user for an input. Please enter your password. And before I do this, I will need to have a scanner. Scanner scan is equal to new scanner system.m. And then I'm going to prompt the user for that input, and I'm going to, let's import the scanner class. And then I'm going to take that in a string called user entered password is equal to scan.next. All right. And then I would like to do something here that says, hey, while something, keep repeating. All right. So what is the condition? And what do I want to repeat? These are the 2 big questions that you need to ask yourself. So the problem statement says, keep asking the user for the password as long as the password is wrong. So the condition is the password is wrong. All right. So basically what we are trying to say here is that as long as the password is wrong, all right, is true. Because while true, repeat. What do I want to repeat? Prompting the user for a new correct password. Do you see the logic here? So it helps always to lay out the logic in comments before you start to actually execute the implementation and add the code. So tell yourself, what do I want to be true here? What I want to be true here is that the password is wrong. All right. So here, if I use user enter password dot equals correct password. Now let's think about it. While the user password is equal to the correct password, so this means that the entered password is correct. Keep repeating. Is that what I want? And the answer is no. You want it to repeat, to go inside the while loop, while it's true that they are not equal. So not equal. Does that make sense? So here in this case, you're asking if they are not equal, I want to go inside the while loop. Go inside the while loop to do what? To reprompt the user for input. So here I'm going to reprompt, but this will give me an error because this has already been declared here and it has this scope all the way down to here. So that's the scope of this, and it covers this one. So I cannot redeclare the same variable within the same scope. So in that case, I have to remove this one. I already declared it before. Okay. So how does that help? The way this helps is that enter the password. I will take your password and check. Is it correct? If not, if it's not correct, go inside, ask the user for a new password. Take this new password, put it in the same variable that I used here. So this way, when I go to the next loop, I will go and check like, hey, is the new password equal or not? All right. Now, notice here that if I continue to enter wrong password, I will never, there is no way for me to get through this while loop. This is like a wall. All right. So there is no way that I can get through this wall until I get the right password and this becomes false. And in that case, I will get out. How does this become false? If the user enter password dot equals correct password is true, not true is false, while false don't get inside, then I will be here. Do you see the sequence? So in that case, this has to evaluate to true, and not true becomes false, and while false stop, then I will be here. So I can safely put here, welcome. If you made it to this other side, this means you made it because you entered the right password. So I can safely tell you, welcome back here. All right. So in this case, if I run this code, right, I can enter disk 55, disk 55. There is no control over how many times I can enter this password. Until you enter it right, you will get welcome. All right. So that's the big difference between the while loop and the for loop. Why? Look at this code. There is not a single counter in here, right? There is no initialized integer. There's no an integer that is incremented, nothing. This is purely controlled using a condition, nothing else. All right. So that is a big difference. This is the major difference between the while loop and the for loop. The for loop, I had a counter. I had to check that counter in a condition. I had a condition, of course, but that condition was in one way or another related to that counter that I incremented and or declared and incremented. All right. So this is important to understand how the while loop is different from the for loop. Of course, if I wanted, the fact that I get, so what if I enter the password correct from the beginning? So disk 45, which would be in here, entering disk 45, scanning this, putting it in user enter password, I check disk 45 is equal to disk 45. The answer is true, yes. So not true is false, while false, don't go inside, bypass, and then print welcome. So that's exactly what's going to happen. So this means that I know that I will never get inside this loop unless I did a mistake. I entered the wrong password. So I could safely here say wrong password please try again. All right, so if I run this one, see, it does not print in the first time, of course, because I'm reading here. And if I enter disk 55, it's going to tell me wrong password, please try again. And then I can enter disk 45. All right, and if I enter disk 45 from the beginning, that would be, again, welcome. So that works. All right, so again, we have seen what a while loop is, how it's different from the for loop. And the next two things that we need to talk about is another variation of that possibly seen in a while loop. All right. And then the last thing is a question about how do I choose or decide which one to use? All right. For loop or while loop. So the other variation that we want to discuss here is that if you have a counter int I is equal to 0, you could combine the increment or the update, all right, with your condition into a single into a single line here by combining the update with the condition itself. The problem with this one is that it's very confusing, and I will tell you, I have never honestly seen anybody does something like this. It's just too confusing, and it's always going to introduce that thing of shift by 1. Because what's happening here is that int I is equal to 0, okay, then I go inside and I say I++. Since it's I++ in a condition, this tells me that plug the I first and then increment later. So I plug 0 in the equation, right, in the relational operation here, and I say, is 0 less than 5? And the answer is true, but I already incremented I by 1. All right, so this means when I print, I'm not going to print the 0, I'm going to print the incremented 1 in here. And that's why we see 1 first. Then it becomes 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5 is less than 5 is no, or like we get to 4. 4 is less than 5, yes, increment it to become 5, print it, it prints 5. All right, and then you go back and 5 is not less than 5, stop. So even though this is possible technically, I have never seen anybody use something like that, and it's just confusing. So, all right, so there is no, if you need to increment right before you print, just do it inside as a separate operation. All right, and then you don't have to confuse yourself in this case. Now, the next question is how to choose between for and while. And if you remember the example I showed you before, I told you, like, if you are doing in the future automation testing and you have to click a button and you go and say click and then click, click, click. All right, this, looking at this, someone will say, like, who taught this guy job, right? Because this here doesn't look good. You could loop this one, right? So that here can become very easy. Int I is equal to 0, I is less than 5, I++, right? And then click inside. All right, so again, to keep this example as a separate, or independent video, what I'm trying to say here is that, let's say again, very quickly, you went to Expedia, the scenario, right? And then what you were trying to test is if I have something like this. I'm going from, or let's go flights, and I want to do some kind of booking of a flight, right? So in this case, what you could do is that we can say, like, hey, I'm going to do this testing and I'm going to go to the website, right? And then I'm going to find the button that says flights, click it, right? Then I'm going to go to the from, find it, print JFK or something, choose JFK, first one. Then I'm going to do to Miami and choose this one. And then select the departing day, select the returning day, click the traveler button. And now I want to go and click this one multiple times. So the question here is, how do you do this? If you go and click, 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 copy and paste the line, that looks bad. Does that make sense? So that does not really look very good in terms of your writing code. Okay, then the better way is to do click, 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 click this. Okay, now the question is, so if I have this option, I could also do it like this. Int I is equal to 0, while I is less than 5, I plus plus. And again, do the same thing, operation of click. Again, I give abstract because we don't know how to do testing yet, but I'm giving abstract examples just to give you the idea. So the question is, which one should I use? Should I go with this one or that one? And again, if you put either one, nobody will look at this and say like, oh, look at this guy. He doesn't know how to code. Why did he put the while loop when he was supposed to use for? Nobody will say that, right? But copying and pasting, that's bad. Choosing one of these two, not a big difference, okay? But for you as a programmer, as a person who's writing code, you will naturally develop that skill of choosing which one to work. So for example, for that very specific example, because I know how many times I want to click, I would go with the for loop. All right. So in general, the rule is if you have a counting from predefined starting point to a stop point that you know where you're going, I would go with the for loop because it's concise, elegant, it looks very clean. The while loop, I can do mistakes. I can forget the increment, right? So because if I forget the counter, Java will go mad on me, right? Because I'm going to use it in this one here anyway. So it's not going to, it's going to remind me. It will tell me I don't know what I is, stuff like that. But the one that is most commonly forgotten is the I++, the update part. And that can cause a problem. So in this case, I would go with the for loop in that specific option. Okay, so when would you go with the while loop? I would go with the while loop if I have a situation where I have a condition, right? In that case, I would go with the while loop. I don't know how many times the user is going to enter the password wrong times, right? Or wrong. So in that case, I cannot say go from 1 to what? How many times are you going to enter the wrong password, right? Unless I have a limit, which is like 3 or 4, like, attempts or something, then for loop makes sense. Okay, so if you have a condition, go with the while loop. If you have predefined starting point, end point, go with the for loop. All right, so that's it. The big difference between the for and while, how to choose. If you go with either one, there's no big mistake, but we now understand that while loop gives us a little bit more flexibility than the for loop. The flexibility of depending on pure conditions without counters. We have seen it. All right, that's it.